Would like to call the committee of the whole for the Village of Cary for Tuesday, October 4th, 2022, to order with roll call, please.
Cavelli? Here. Collier?
Here.
Weinhammer? Here. McAlpine? Here. Walrath?
Here.
Thank you. Once again, join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you. Now moving to the public comments, where the public is invited to make an issue-oriented comment of any matter of public concern not otherwise on the agenda. I had one individual, Deputy Chief Chris Winkleman.
Hello, everyone. The chief was kind enough to let me know that there'd be a presentation to an actuarial report. With COVID, it's been a while since the Police Pension Fund has made a presentation to the board. I am the president of that fund. I've been doing that for 10 years, so I just wanted to come up, give you a quick recap, just kind of a real rough stance of where we're at and see if you had any questions for me. When I took over the pension fund about 10 years ago, it had about, I think, $5 or $6 million. Earlier this year, we were approaching $17 million. Our payees, our retirees, went from 6 when I started to now I think we're approximately 16. So that has increased dramatically. We did take a hit due to the economy. Not as bad as thought, because we were in the process of switching all our funds over to the state, who now manages the investments. We were one of the first police funds in the state to do that. That did start around March and was completed shortly after. During that time, we had some excess funds with our old investment manager, as well as a deposit from the village. So we did have about $1 million that was out of the market. I think that did help us a little bit. Right now, all the funds are with the state, and I believe as the end of August, we were about $15.7 million. So that's just a quick recap. Like I said, I've been on the fund 10 years. Michael Runs is the vice president. Bruce Brandwein is an attorney. He's been in the fund for 20 or 25 years. Chris Sporl's been in the fund for about 10 years. And retired Sergeant Ed Sinek is also on the board. We did used to have our own actuarial, but when the village switched different actuarials, we jumped on board with that. So it not only saved the pension fund, but it's just easier for us to look at the numbers when they're already being created. Any questions for me?
No, thank you. We're just going to get wonderful reports very shortly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the only item we have on tonight's agenda is a discussion regarding the police pension fund and actuarial projection. So we'll turn it over to Foster and Foster.
Thank you very much for having me here tonight. I appreciate the opportunity to go through the report with you every year. Hopefully you all have the report in your meeting packets there, and I'm going to start you on page 5 of that report. It says summary of report at the top, and basically it's your bottom line on top. It shows you last year's numbers on the right-hand side. This year's numbers will be in the leftmost column. There will be a middle column that's introduced as we flip through the pages to show you the impact of the assumption changes that were implemented this year. But on the summary page, we just show kind of the final last year, final this year. The bottom number here, village recommended contribution, was $1,215,000 to almost $16,000 last year, up to $1,255,000 this year. That's about a 3.3% increase year over year. That's largely driven by, one, the assumption changes that were implemented, and then the other thing is the methodology that's employed in this fund does have a payroll growth component to it, and that payroll growth assumption basically guarantees that every year the amortization payment on the unfunded is going to increase, all else being equal in the fund. So you're effectively, if all of our assumptions come true, you will see a year-over-year increase in this number.
Just as a matter of record, that the page number you're referring to in our packet's number 7.
Number 7, okay. So I guess I'll add 2 to any number I referenced.
Well, yeah, Foster and Foster's page 5, our page 7, just for
Yes.
everyone following along.
Yep.
So,
All right, thank you. In addition, the plan did have some favorable year-over-year experience. So we did see more inactive mortality than we had anticipated. Salary increases were a bit lower than we had anticipated. And then the investment return, ironically, the investment return actually was positive, and that's due to the smoothing methodology that we employ. We don't use market value of assets to calculate the contribution. We actually smooth the market value over a 5-year time frame so that we mitigate some of that volatility that you would see in the numbers year over year. Okay, so if I turn to page 6 of that report, which is 8 of your packet, you can see the changes since the prior valuation here. We do list the changes that were implemented here. These were largely driven by an experience study that was performed for the Consolidated Police Pension Fund. We had been relying on a 2017 report that was done on all Article 3 funds in the state of Illinois through the Department of Insurance back in 2017. This is the same study, it's just commissioned by a different group now. It's commissioned by the Consolidated Fund. Foster & Foster actually did perform that analysis this time around, and we did implement those changes. Because you were relying on those 2017 tables, it made sense to update to the new tables with the newest data. So those were largely implemented. The other assumption that we made was to reduce that payroll growth assumption. So that guaranteed increase on that amortization payment was 3.75% per year. We've reduced that down to 3.5%. That does come with short-term increases in the contribution, but long-term, you won't see as much of an increase. We'd like to continue to see that come down with time. The lower you can make that payroll growth assumption, the lower the increase in your contribution year over year. So it stabilizes the contribution if you can bring it down. It's expensive to bring down, and we'll get into that in a few more pages.
So Heidi, we would assume next year then probably to look at another 0.25%
Yes.
payroll growth assumption.
Yeah, typically we don't like to move it, unless the boards are open to that. We typically would move it about 0.25 basis points a year until we get to a place where everybody's comfortable with that. And there could be more assumption or more methodology changes that will be implemented in the future, and I'll highlight some of those as well. Okay, so if we turn to page 7, which is 9 of your meeting packet, we get into the numbers here, and there are a lot of numbers, I understand. Just going to hit the highlights. If we focus on that the leftmost column here will be this year's numbers. This is where that middle column comes in. You can see what the numbers would have been had we not implemented those assumption changes, and then last year's numbers on the right-hand side. Section 8 at the top just tells us the data that we're working with. We do use snapshot valuation data, meaning that whoever's in the plan, whatever status they have on the valuation date is who we're valuing. So as of May 1st, we look at who's in the plan and what their status is, and that's what's included here. At that point in time, your actives were still 24. That's based on a year-over-year change. 2 retirements happened in that time frame. 1 termination happened in that time frame, so your retiree count did go up by those 2. Your terminated vested count did go up by that 1, and then you replace those with 3 new entrants. And so that's how we stabilize the count of the actives there. And then your beneficiary count did decrease due to the mortality decrement. Okay. If we look at section B here, this is the assets that we use to do the valuation. You can see market value versus actuarial value. This is that 5-year smoothing that I was talking about. If you look at the relationship last year, you could see that the actuarial value lagged the market value. This tells me you had outstanding gains on the books that were not yet reflected. Now that situation is reversed. If we look at this year's numbers, that relationship is the opposite. Actual value is greater than the market value, which tells me you have some deferred losses on the books that still need to be reflected. This is exactly what the assumption is supposed to do, or the smoothing method is supposed to do, so that you don't see that volatility, because you could see the year-over-year changes in the market can be quite volatile and would cause the contribution to be a lot more volatile. So section C is the liability calculation. This is the first calculation that we perform, the present value of benefits here. If we look at that $33.1 million number, what that represents is if you had $33.1 million in the fund today, you would be fully funded on this population, assuming that all of our actual assumptions were completely true and came to fruition in the future. Nobody would fund to that number, though, because all those actives have not yet earned the service that's baked into that number. So if we turn to page 8 or 10 of your packet, you could see here near the bottom of that leftmost column is the total actual accrued liability of $28.3 million. That number represents the value of the liability that has been accrued to date. This is what you're funding towards. If we compare that to the actual value of assets, the line below that is the unfunded actual accrued liability. So that's the service that's been earned already, but is not yet covered in the assets, is not yet paid for effectively. This becomes a component of your contribution, basically a mortgage on that unfunded that you do need to pay down. That gives you a funded status of 57.6%, which is improved year over year. So you're going in the right direction, so we always like to see that. Hopefully we continue to see that. That's largely attributable to the fact that the village is actually contributing the numbers that we're coming to you with. If that wasn't true, we may not see that. We may see that number come down in the future. The only other number I want to point out on this page is near the middle of that leftmost column, that 507,983. That's the value of your active police officers earning 1 year of benefits in the pension fund. So that'll also be a component of your contribution. And if we turn to page 10, we'll see what that looks like. Page 10 or 12 of your meeting packet. Section E here details all of the components of that contribution calculation. So you see the normal cost, and now here all of the numbers do have interest to the year end because we know these contributions aren't made on our valuation date, they're made later in the year. So that's the only difference that you're seeing here. But this is that normal cost number that we talked about, the value of the actives earning 1 year of service. We add to that the administrative expenses, the cost of administering the fund each year, and if we subtract from that the expected member contributions, because remember, the police officers do contribute 9.91% of their salary towards this benefit. Those three numbers on an ongoing basis would be your contribution if you were 100% funded. So in a perfect world, that's where we are. That is eventually where we'd like to end up. But we do have that large number in the middle of that column, that $896,657. That's that mortgage on the unfunded that we're paying down. So that we're amortizing that over a 19-year period. And that is 71% of the recommended contribution of $1,255,242 is just paying down that contribution. So I guess the good news is in 19 years that goes away. It's going to take some time to get there though. Okay, section F here at the bottom is one I like to look at for the health of the fund. If you look at the village contribution of $1,184,000 and you compare that to the village requirement over that time frame of $1,185,000, you can see that you contributed almost a match to what we suggested should go into the fund. So I could see that the village is actually contributing these numbers and taking them seriously, which is a good thing to see. Don't see that at every plan in Illinois. So just pointing that out. If we look at page 12, so that's 14 of your packet. This is the development of that amortization payment. I want to highlight something here. The bottom right-hand number of this page is this $837,997. That's the beginning of the year calculation. But this is the amortization using the 3.5% payroll growth assumption over 19 years. If I was to reduce that payroll growth assumption down to 2%, that $838,000 effectively goes up to $939,000. So it's about a $101,000 increase to decrease that 150 basis points, to decrease the payroll growth. So you can see why we move it in increments, but ultimately that's the target. We'd like to see that come down. Okay. Page 14, which is 16 of your packet, shows you the reconciliation of changes in the contribution requirement. So what this does is take last year's recommended amount on line item 1, this year's recommended amount on line item 3, and shows you how we got from point A to point B. So you can see the biggest drivers here were really that increase in the amortization due to the payroll growth assumption. So all else being equal, this is going to happen each year. We're going to see about a $32,000 increase in the contribution. It'll be a little less now. We did bring that down from 3.75% to 3.5%. So that number might be $30,000 or $28,000 next year, but it's still going to always be positive. If we look at the other line that's contributing here is that assumption change line. About $33,000 of this increase was just attributable to the fact that we did update the assumptions in the plan. A lot of that's going to be that payroll growth assumption as well, the fact that we'd reduced that 25 basis points. So those were the biggest drivers. There's some noise here with respect to some of the assumptions that were made and how those came true or didn't, and you could see the positives and negatives as a result of that in terms of experience. But net overall was favorable in terms of the experience to the fund. Okay. If I turn you to page 16, this is a page that shows you the contribution requirement at an alternate interest rate. So we do assume 7% for the recommended contribution in this fund, but we offer a contribution at 6.5% as an alternative, just to illustrate to you the impact of that interest rate. At this point in time, it's hard to say where the right place to be is. Consolidation has happened. The funds have moved over, as the board president had suggested. And with that, some of the restrictions on how the fund was able to invest. So The investments have opened up more, and they have the ability to invest in things that weren't available to your funds before. And so with that, we expect returns to be a little bit higher than they were, just based on the lifting of those restrictions alone. And then, theoretically, consolidation saves on some of the administrative expenses and such. That can be debated. That's still to be determined. But certainly the idea that you can invest more liberally should make the return be higher than it's been in the past. So this is a wait and see thing. Right now, we don't recommend moving off the 7%. We do show you the 6.5 versus 7%. The Consolidated Police Pension Board did select an interest rate of 6.8% that are going to be used in the actuarial reports that the Consolidated Board produces. So, we're in that range. It's in the range of reasonable. This is a long-term assumption. It's really hard to predict, but 7% it's probably on the higher end of the range of what's reasonable, but we don't feel uncomfortable about where you are, and we are sort of in a wait-and-see position. Right now, they are passively invested. They will be moving to active management over the next 3 to 5 years as they interview investment managers and such. So, this is a long-term assumption. We're not targeting in the next 3 to 5 years, but we might see it lag a little bit in the next 3 to 5 years, depending on what the markets are doing and how much active management would have contributed to an increase there.
I think it's important to point out for the board as well, the second item from the bottom, where you can see just what that would do if we'd go to 6.5% just to our payment. It would be another $200,000, this year. So we're for staying with the 7% for now, certainly.
And I think it was more compelling to look at that lower rate prior to consolidation, because you were more restricted in how you could invest. Being less restricted now, 6.5% would be considered on the conservative end of the range based on the investments that have been suggested, what their investment policies that are posted and available out there. So, okay. So if we look at page 18 of the report, page 18 does summarize all of the assumptions that were used here. That's 18 of our report, 20 of your meeting packet. So we have 3 pages here that do summarize the assumptions. I did highlight that the interest rate that the Consolidated Board is using is 6.8%. You're at 7%. Just for reference, the Fire Board was a little bit more aggressive in their assumption setting, and the Fire Board is going to be using 7.125%. And by the Fire Board, I mean the Consolidated Fire Board with all the Article 4 funds. So the police and fire did take a bit of a different approach on that, but you're right in the middle of those 2 numbers. So I don't feel badly at all about where you are there. Pointing out the mortality, we did update. We were already using these public sector tables. These are public safety tables based on national data from all police or all safety officers across the country. We had been using those for a couple years. The additions that were made here to that assumption were really customizing it to the Article 3 funds in Illinois, and then we did implement what's called generational mortality. So what that means is somebody born in 1980 is not expected to live as long as somebody who's born in 1981, who isn't expected to live as long as somebody who's born in 1982, et cetera. So every birth year is expected to live a little bit longer than the prior birth year. That's called generational mortality, and that is now implemented in this valuation as well. That's sort of the direction that the actual profession's going in general, and so that is incorporated into your report now. We also did update the retirement, disability, and termination rates. Most of those changes were pretty neutral, just little tweaks here and there to the tables. The retirement was a little bit more significant. As you know, police officer retirement ages have been coming down, and in the last 5 years when we looked at that, we did see a lower retirement age than we had been assuming for police officers, meaning that they're going to be in annuity status longer, so that did increase the liability a little bit, but better reflective of what we think the future will look like. On page 19, we do show the salary increases. Those didn't change a lot, but just to point one other thing out here, the funding policy amortization method is still tied to the end date funding. We think that it's possible that at some point the state of Illinois is going to kick this out to 2050. We don't know when that'll happen, obviously. We don't recommend chasing that. We would not suggest that you deviate from, push this out further, but there is a methodology that we have seen employed and worked pretty well for a lot of funds, and that's a rolling 15 amortization method. So as you start approaching that 15-year time frame, it might be worth looking at taking this and rolling the amortization period, which means basically every year, whatever the unfunded is, we just re-amortize it over 15 years. So it's basically like re-amortizing your mortgage annually. It does slow down how quickly you pay down the unfunded. So some people don't like that method for that reason, but it does spread the unfunded payments out over future generations of taxpayers, not just the next 20 years of taxpayers. So that's something to think about when you're looking at generational equity as well. So we've seen some funds implement that, and that's worked well. You're not at a point where you need to make a decision about that yet, but it is something to keep on the radar. You still have 19 years in the amortization schedule here, so we have some time. Okay, I'm gonna flip you all the way to page 30 now, which is 32 of your meeting packet. Just to point out the active split here by tier. At this point in time, you are 50-50 tier 1 versus tier 2. So back in 2011, they implemented a second tier to the police officers' pension benefits. That tier has lower benefits than tier 1 had. And so the normal costs and the payments that come from those will be lower. So every tier 2 officer has a lower normal cost than the tier 1 officers, just to point out. So over time, you'll see that continue to evolve as your tier 1s retire out and you are replacing them with tier 2s. Okay? If I look at page 31 quickly, just to point out your age and service distribution here, we have age down the left-hand side, and service across the top. Focus on the bottom right-hand corner of this table, and we look at anybody with more than 20 years of service over age 50, there was nobody eligible to retire on our valuation date. So all your retirements had already taken place. If we back that off 5 years and look at anybody over 15 years of service, over age 45, so in the next 5 years, could they retire? We only had 3 people. So that's only about 12 to 13% of your population that will be retirement eligible in the next 5 years. That's a good place for the fund to be. It gives the fund time to let its money work for it, as opposed to having to worry about, large cash flows coming up in a short order.
Can I
And
ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
Do you guys request people to put their retirement in a certain amount in advance? Or maybe this is a question for the chief? No? So there's, no? Right, I was just curious.
Now, they make application to the pension fund for that, but they're not required to give us prior notice. They do, so we can do some planning, but they don't have to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and so the last thing I want to point out is on page 33 or 35 of your meeting packet. There is a 3-page summary of the Article 3 pension benefits here that are provided to police officers, broken down by tier 1 versus tier 2. I'm not going to go through all of this. I just wanted to point it out because it's a lot easier to read than Article 3 of the Illinois Pension Code if you've ever attempted that. But it is a quick reference if you did have questions about the differences and what the tiers get. One more thing to quickly point out, I did mention the market volatility. So there are more pages in this report. They're basically audit numbers, so the GASB numbers here, starting after the plan provisions on page 36. The audit numbers don't have the concept of smoothing in them. Auditors don't tend to like smoothing. So when we look at page 37, you could see that the funded status effectively on an accounting basis is much more volatile. So you saw how on the funding basis, we saw a 2% increase in funded status. Here we went from 62% funded down to 57% year over year just because of using market value of assets. So there's a lot of volatility by not smoothing. So with that, are there any other questions about the numbers?
I do have a question.
Sure.
You had kind of talked a little about when we're supposed to have this all 95% funded by 2040. There is talk with some of the other associations that we belong to trying to get that extended to 2050. That's something you don't recommend?
We don't recommend that you amortize over that long of a period of time. So in the actual profession, we'd like to see get that unfunded paid down. You are working towards that and accomplishing that. Kicking that out to 2050 will just slow down the payments towards the principal on that unfunded.
Well, I mean, where we are right now compared to where we were several years ago, we're at a much better stage. So it's according to, in hearing what I hear through the other associations, that we're higher than a lot of other communities are right now.
And I think it's important to note, one of the changes with consolidation was, in the actuarial world, it used to be that you'd get a report from the Department of Insurance, the board could have their own report, and the village could have their own report. There could be 3 actuaries involved with 3 different numbers, and you were required to pay the minimum of those 3 numbers. So if you could get somebody to come in here and give you a much lower number and use a 9% interest rate, we wouldn't do that as an actuary, but there were some actuaries back in the day that were willing to do that. That was the minimum that you had to pay towards this fund. That's no longer the case with consolidation. The minimum required contribution will come from the consolidated fund our numbers will tend to be higher because they are only funding to 90% by 2040. We're funding all 100% of the unfunded, which is the better way to think of things. And then, to the extent that you do want to make methodology changes to our report going forward, so that 15-year rolling that I mentioned, other methodologies that we could employ here, that's up to you and at your discretion, but it always has to be higher than what you get from the Department of Insurance. The contribution is the greater of the two numbers.
Anybody else have any other questions? Thank you. We appreciate everything you do. These numbers they look pretty good, all things considered.
Yeah, I think so too. Given the markets, I think that smoothing really is helping people out.
Heidi, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having me
Thank you
here
very
tonight.
much. That being said, that will conclude our evening. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned at 6:29. Thanks again, Heidi.